Minister, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you all here today. My name is Anna Manberg and I'm the coordinator of this year's symposium. Before we start the opening ceremony and the opening discussion, I would like to take this opportunity to give you some practical information. This and many sessions are filmed and broadcasted live via the symposium website. The broadcast will also be available for viewing after the symposium. Please remember to turn your cell phones to vibrate during the sessions, and please note where the nearest fire exits are located. During the lunch break tomorrow, we will, for the first time, arrange a networking lunch. Pre-booking is required for this lunch, so please check your name badge and see if you are booked for this event. For those of you who have bought a ticket to the dinner tomorrow evening and the award ceremony, and dinner takes place at the Stockholm City Hall. And if you need help with directions or if you have any questions, please contact us at the registration desk. And you were also given a dinner ticket at the registration, so please remember to bring this along with you. And most importantly, please be there on time at 6:30 p.m. With those practical words, we'll now turn to the opening ceremony. So please welcome the Director General of the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention, Mr. Erik Wennerström.
Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stockholm Criminology Symposium. Let me start out by taking this opportunity to honor the memory of former State Secretary Magnus Graner, who sadly passed away last year. One of Magnus's many life achievements was the establishment of the Foundation for the Stockholm Prize in Criminology that has now secured all future prizes for us to celebrate here in Stockholm. He was deeply involved in these issues, and it was truly a privilege to work with him. When the prize is awarded tomorrow evening, let us all recall that we are forever indebted to Magnus Graner. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, this is the 10th Stockholm Criminology Symposium. Yes, we are looking back at a decade of celebrating knowledge in the field of criminology. This year, we have participants from over 30 countries and over 500 registered participants to the symposium, divided into 58 sessions and around 200 speakers. The main theme of the symposium this year is opportunities for crime and situational crime preventions. And we will devote 23 of the sessions to this main theme. We also have the general theme at the symposium, which is contemporary criminology, for which we have devoted 31 sessions and 4 plenary sessions. The great poet teaches us that between the acting of a dreadful thing and the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasma or a hideous dream. In that interim that Shakespeare describes in Julius Caesar, Act 2, Scene 1, lies opportunities to commit crimes and other dreadful things. And it is these opportunities and ways of reducing them that this year's prize winners have devoted their research to. Let me address a special welcome to our prize winners, Ronald Clark, Professor of Rutgers University, and Patricia Mayhe, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, who will give their prize winners lectures tomorrow at between 1:30 and 2:45. I would also like to give a special welcome to the Minister for Justice and Migration, Mr. Morgan Johansson, who will soon be participating in the opening discussions here. From reading the abstracts in the program book and seeing all of you researchers and practitioners here, I'm convinced that we will have 3 very fruitful and interesting days. This evening, I would recommend also the poster session and the welcome reception in the atrium right outside here, starting at 5 o'clock. This poster session gives you a chance to network and meet other researchers and discuss their work and your work. As was mentioned in the introduction, we will arrange a networking lunch during the lunch break tomorrow. And we hope that you will find that this lunch is a good way to network with your colleagues. We are very honored that Rutgers University will host tomorrow's networking lunch. This year, the Jerry Lee Lecture will be given by Lorraine Mazerol. Lorraine Mazerol is a research professor in the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. This lecture will focus on the ripple effects of police experimentation, and it will take place on Wednesday between 11 and 12. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also express my thanks to you all for coming here. By bringing your work to the Stockholm Criminology Symposium and being ready to share it with all of us, new knowledge is spread, new connections are made, and we will all return richer from the symposium. Thanks to you. With this, I wish you all a very rewarding symposium. Thank you. We will now turn to the opening discussion, and I would like to introduce the moderator, who will then introduce the other panelists. Professor Gloria Laycock graduated in psychology from University College London, and it is also there that she completed her PhD. She worked in the Home Office for over 30 years, out of which almost 20 years were spent on research and development in the policing and crime prevention fields. She has extensive research experience from the UK and has acted as a consultant and trainer on policing and crime prevention in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, India, South Africa, and in the Middle East. She is now serving as a professor of crime science at the University College London, and is also the director of the Commission Partnership Research Consortium, consisting of 8 UK universities supporting the What Works Centre for Crime Reduction. She was awarded an OBE in 2008 for her services to crime policy. Please assist me in welcoming Professor Gloria Laycock.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Wow, thank you very much indeed. I love this mic. It makes me feel like Madonna. Can you see me? I think not. I'll walk this way. It's horrible when there's a sort of voice coming out of the void. Minister, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to start with my favourite quote, because I think it's quite relevant to this conference. It goes, if we have data, then let's look at data. But if all we have are opinions, then let's go with mine. And in my opinion, this is actually probably the best criminology conference on offer these days. It's the only one I happily come to, and I know I'm going to get an enormous amount from it, and I hope you all do too. My task right now is to introduce the distinguished panel, and I'm going to begin with Ron Clark, the prize winner, who is university professor and former dean at the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University. He's also a visiting professor at the Gilles Dandeau Institute at UCL. Before moving from his native UK to the United States in 1984, he was employed for 15 years in the British government's research unit, becoming its director in 1982. Ron's the founding editor of the Crime Prevention Study Series and the author or joint author of more than 250 books, monographs and papers. That's what it says on the Rutgers website. What it doesn't say on the Rutgers website is how single-minded Ron's been in his research effort over about 50-odd years. I won't embarrass him with the numbers of the years he's been doing this. How dedicated he's been, or even how much he likes parrots. Please welcome Ron Clark. Okay, Ron, have a seat. Sit down. Yes. The second prize winner this year, as you all know, is Patricia Mayhe, OBE. She's a criminological consultant in the UK and a former deputy head of the Crime and Criminal Justice Unit at the UK's Interior Ministry, that's the Home Office. She's worked at the National Institute of Justice in Washington, DC, the Australian Institute of Criminology in Canberra, and she helped in 1982 to design the British Crime Survey, now the Crime Survey for England and Wales, serving as co-author of its early reports and managing it until 2000. She's also been very closely involved, as many of you will know, with the International Crime Victims Survey. From 2004 to 2008, Pat was director of the Crime and Justice Research Centre at Victoria University in New Zealand, and she currently serves as a non-executive member of the UK Statistics Authority's Crime Statistics Advisory Council. In 1998, Queen Elizabeth II appointed her to the rank of Officer of the Order of the British Empire, the Services to Criminology. Pat Mayhe. Our third panellist is Kate Bowers, who is Professor of Crime Science at the Jill Dando Institute at UCL. Kate's worked in the field of crime science for almost 20 years. You won't believe this when you see her, because she just doesn't look old enough. Her research interests focus on the use of quantitative methods in crime analysis and crime prevention, and she's published over 70 papers and book chapters in criminology and crime science. She serves on a number of journal editorial boards and is an academic expert for Crime and Policing Group in the British Home Office and expert reviewer for a project run by the US Office of the Assistant Attorney General. Kate Bowers. And our final academic is Lorraine Mazerole, who is a research professor in the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. She's an experimental criminologist and elected fellow of both the Academy of Experimental Criminology and the Academy of Social Science in Australia, and winner of the Joan McCord Award in Experimental Criminology. Lorraine will give the Jerry Lee Lecture on June the 10th. The lecture will focus on the ripple effects of police experimentation. Lorraine. And finally, we have the Minister. Morgan Johansson is Minister for Justice and Migration. He has a huge list of policy responsibilities, including the Constitution of Sweden, the judiciary, criminal, civil and procedural law, crime prevention issues, prison and probation services, victim and crime issues, and of course, migration. He began his career as a journalist, but quickly moved into politics to become a political advisor in the Prime Minister's office. In 1998, he became a member of the Riksdag, where he has had numerous responsibilities, including Minister for Public Health and Social Services. I think of particular note for us today is his chairmanship from 1999 to 2002 of the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention. We can therefore expect a series of searching questions, I think, for our panelists today. Mr. Johansson. My role now is to start the discussion, and I'm going to invite each of the four panelists to summarize the most important pieces of research in which they've been involved or of which they've become aware over the recent past, which addresses the topic of this symposium, opportunities for crime and situational crime prevention, researchers' advice to policy. Great topic, and I'd like to ask Ron Clark to go first. You can stay there, Ron. Just stay sitting. You can just speak through your mic.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gloria. Gloria has told me to be brief, and I'll try to be. I believe that crime policy has been too much focused on the offender and has mostly neglected the opportunities for crime of which the offender takes advantage. Consequently, we've been dealing with only half the problem, because crime results from the interaction of a motivated offender and a criminal opportunity. A second mistake of crime policy has been that it has relied too heavily on the criminal justice system to change offender decisions. I think society must do more to identify existing opportunities for crime and work harder to eliminate them. In many cases, those who will have to be involved in this work are the private sector, agencies, businesses, and organizations who inadvertently have played a role in creating the specific crime opportunities that need to be shut down. This means that governments will have to find new ways of partnering with the private sector to prevent crime. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Pat.
Gloria, I thought your question to us was to address the theme of this session, which is what I prepared. But I will also answer the other question about the most important portion of my work that I've done, what I think has contributed most. And I would have to say victimization surveys, which I think speak to the situational crime prevention agenda very, very directly in showing the contours of ordinary crime and the sorts of things we should be thinking about preventing. It shows how many crimes occur that doesn't come within the scope of the criminal justice system at all. So I think that gives a very clear perspective on the things that we should be thinking about. But in terms of what I prepared, which is remarks on what would I say in relation to situational crime prevention and researchers' advice to policy, well, I had thought of 2 points. And the first point is really more addressed to researchers themselves in relation to their interface with policy. Many here will be much more convinced of the effectiveness of situational crime prevention than many policymakers might be, and you should certainly be more knowledgeable. But if policymakers aren't as convinced about the effectiveness of situational crime prevention, it's because we haven't told them well enough. We need to talk to them and make them understand what the possibilities are. We're going to be here for 2.5 days talking to each other in our language using our jargon, and people outside don't necessarily understand it. So I think the first job to be done is to make sure we speak to policymakers in a language they understand and in a way that they can take forward themselves. The second point is that we should be telling policy people, especially those in the criminal justice system, that they can do most by incentivizing others, by nagging others, and if necessary, by making others outside government accept responsibility for reducing crime. Ken Pease, as you'll all remember, said the first step was products being developed without consideration of crime consequences. The second step was then the crime harvest, and the third step was then retrofitting solutions. So what policy needs to do from within the criminal justice sector is to make it clear to others the crime consequences of new products that they're thinking about or developing or indeed have already developed. And by products, clearly I don't just mean new iPhones, technology. I mean housing design and layout, the design of transport systems, leisure facilities, schools, colleges, business estates, industrial estates, and so forth. So criminal justice policy leaders then must exert influence on policy leaders in other fields of government, in housing, in leisure, in recreation, in education. And these agencies, I think, are much more relevant to the crime prevention agenda in many senses, certainly in relation to situational crime prevention, than criminal justice itself. So then they, in turn, these other agencies, must incentivize, nag, and make other people do things better. I think there has been some progress, but probably still a long way to go. Thank you.
Kate.
Good morning, everybody. I think that probably one of the most central current issues in situational crime prevention is how we can enable effective and, importantly, appropriate delivery of it in practice. And I think the time ought to be right to do this because in many countries there's a political climate at the moment which encourages evidence-based approaches to solving various social hardships. So, for example, in the UK, the government has supported the development of 7 What Works centres, which are supposed to promote the informed decision-making process on issues like health, education, better ageing, economic growth. And fortunately for us, there's also one on crime prevention. At UCL, we've been working with the College of Policing in developing the What Works Centre for Crime Reduction. And I think out of that work, there's probably 2 really major issues that are particularly relevant that have arisen concerning situational crime prevention. The first is that the where, the when, the why, and the how of crime prevention is absolutely as important as the what to do. This is particularly important for crime prevention, which is so context-specific. So, for instance, for example, we know it's all very well for us to know that gating off vulnerable alleyways in residential housing areas is going to alleviate burglary problems, generally. It's useful for us to know that. But what is also important to the practitioner to know is the context in which that positive change can most likely to be brought about. So, for example, a practitioner will need to know about the particular type of housing estate, the kind of physical layout of those places that's necessary for that change. They'll need to know about, they'll also need to know about the policy makers and the skills the policy makers ought to have in bringing about that change. And they'll need to know, they'll need to make sure that the advice that they're given is very locally relevant for them in terms of being able to make effective decisions. And one of the things we've been doing at UCL as part of the What Works Centre work is we've been producing an evidence appraisal tool, which is called Emmy, which you'll be able to hear about this afternoon if you go to the What Works session, which is exactly trying to do that. It's trying to put the context and give locally relevant advice to practitioners. And the second major issue that came out of the work that we've been doing has been identifying the gaps in our current understanding and in the current evidence base. And we got an opportunity to do a review of systematic reviews in crime reduction recently. And it was fairly, and the distribution of the reviews is fairly telling. So of 330 reviews that we found that look at crime reduction in some ways, only 10% of those, 34 of those I think it was, looked at situational crime prevention interventions, whereas 47% concentrated on offender-orientated interventions, drug rehabilitation, for instance, community correction, those types of things. So we really need to work out why there's that underrepresentation of evidence about situational crime prevention in the systematic reviews. And just finally, in looking at the systematic reviews that do come out, they very often give advice about whether something is effective or not, but there's still a real paucity and shockingly few reviews that give that important context, which is useful for practitioners. So there's very few of them that give us information about cost effectiveness, or there's very few of us that tell us about how to implement measures, as well as what measures to implement. And I think we need to make sure we get further primary evaluation research started to fill that gap. Thank you.
Lorraine.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on something very more specific and something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's partnerships in crime prevention. So my colleague Janet Ransley, who I think is here today, and I have been working on this topic for a number of years, and previously Michael Berger and I in the United States. So the whole sort of focus around partnerships, we assume that police and other criminal justice agents will forge partnerships. Some of these partnerships are mandated in the Scottish legislation now. The police are expected to forge these partnerships. There's a lot of incentives put out there so that police and other criminal justice agent representatives forge these partnerships, and partnerships are encouraged. But there's a bit of a problem, and the problem is that we actually don't know what partnerships work, which ones work to block opportunities, which ones don't, for what sorts of problems and in what sorts of situations. So even though the police are encouraged to forge these partnerships, we really don't know which ones are going to work best in what situations. So the evidence is extremely limited, and more often than not, there's a huge silence about it. It's just sort of there. And I really want to change that, and I would like the help of policymakers to do that. So there is 3 things that we actually know about partnerships. So at the street level drug market level, which I've done quite a bit of research at that level, we know that those partnerships that are forged at the community level actually seem to work best. But those are those partnerships that are forged at the community level but then are delivered very much at the micro place level, at the hotspot level. But the partnerships that are forged sort of at a broader community level seem to have the most traction over time, but the delivery at the micro level. The second thing that we're starting to see is the difference between dyad relationships, those partnerships between the police and one other partner, versus those partnerships that are quite complex, those multinodal partnerships. And we don't have a lot of systematic evidence to tell us which ones work best, but the anecdotal evidence seems to be that those dyad relationships, those very focused relationships, seem to be easier to manage, they're more sustainable over time, and they can deliver a better service. So the third thing that's starting to emerge from the evidence that we're starting to build now is that these partnerships work best when the partner, the third party, actually has access to some legal levers that are not necessarily available to police. So these are a whole broad range of legal levers. These could be health and safety legal levers, truancy legislation, alcohol serving, responsible serving of alcohol legislation. So legislations that sort of sit on the periphery of criminal justice that can be mobilised in a fairly explicit manner to deal with crime problems. So really 3 take-home messages. The first is that I think that there is a need for us to explore these partnerships and explore them using good research scientific methods. We need some guidance as to how police, I'm coming from the policing perspective, how these partnerships can be forged, and we need to find out what works in what situations and for what problems. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think our speakers have pretty well covered the whole field of crime prevention, situational crime prevention, from high-level policy right down to the street. So, Minister, perhaps you've got some questions lined up.
Yes, I do. I have a number of questions, of course, and But I'll start to say that it's really a privilege to have you here. Welcome to have you here in Stockholm these 3 days, and it's going to be very interesting to follow the conference here, because I think it's all about making for us as decision makers. It's very important for us to have this connection to the research society, and making research into practical solutions. That's the key for us. And I think Patricia said that sometimes we need to hear, you need to speak to us in a language that we understand, and we understand the practical solutions. But I'd like to start with a question about the balance of social and situational crime prevention, because that is something that we are, of course, always discussing. Coming from this country, where which is an ambitious welfare state, but for the last 20 years or so have seen more and more economic differences, and also a bigger social exclusion. Of course, that is a discussion that we have really up in our face now, about how do we stop the recruitment to criminal gangs and so on. So we have been very much focusing on the social prevention side, and but as we all understand that we need to do more than that. We also must focus on the situational prevention side, and that's where your expertise comes in. I'd like to, if you can elaborate a little bit about the balance there between the social and situational prevention strategies, as a start for this sort of discussion.
Got to be to Ron. He touched on that right at the very beginning.
Right. I think that most of the so-called social prevention initiatives are things that society should be trying to do anyway. Any good society should be trying to do. I'm not sure it has very much relevance to crime. In fact, I don't think it does have much relevance to crime. It might improve conditions in some cases for crime, but the reason for doing that is that it's the right thing to do. If you want to reduce crime, you've got to focus on the drivers of crime. I know many people believe that the so-called root causes of crime are the things that should be attacked. But opportunity is the prime root cause of crime. And that is something we can do something about immediately. And if we do that, I think we can bring about immediate reductions in crime. So I think and I don't think actually, as I'm just repeating myself here, I don't think that the criminal justice system has really a great deal more to do than it does already in terms of reducing crime. I think that we have to take seriously, and I don't think we really do yet, situational crime prevention takes seriously opportunities for crime and does usually very small, focused projects. But overall, opportunities for crime is something that society has neglected. And that is where I believe the true gains are to be made if we're going to try to reduce crime further than it is now.
I think that's going to be covered quite in some detail in the session on the crime drop, which is attempting to really demonstrate with data how important situational crime prevention's been in delivering the kinds of massive crime drops that we've seen across most of the Western world in the recent past. Does anybody else want to chip in on that particular question, or should we move on to another?
Well, I was going to say much the same thing, but add the point that you can't forget social crime prevention because there's such a big weight behind it. And if it's not, as Ron said, to reduce crime, it's to improve educational achievement, it's to stop parents being driven mad in the teenage years. So it's going to happen. But, I mean, it is worth bearing in mind that the evidence for social crime prevention of manageable kinds, like leisure centres and football pitches, is not particularly promising. And that the more promising elements, like early intervention programmes, are extremely expensive, and we haven't really learned how to properly target them. And in terms of situational crime prevention, I think one thing that will probably come out over the next few days is that from the point of view of government, it actually costs them a lot less, because it's going to be businesses and it's going to be other commercial agencies who want to do it for the sake of their own profits. So it's a lot cheaper for government.
Ideally. Want to challenge that? It's a bit radical.
No. Just one remark then, because we also know that it's a majority of the number of reported crimes are committed by very, very few individuals. So, I mean, that's the argument for trying to work with these few individuals with social measures in order to. And I know a study when I was chairman of the Council of Crime Prevention 15 years ago. There was a report saying that, well, we followed up the people who were born in 1960, and the number of crimes that these people, the whole cohort has been committed until the year 2000. Then 50% of all the reported crimes had been committed by 1.8% of that cohort, which of course tells us that, well, if you can work with and find the young people who are, well, going the wrong way early with social measures, of course, that would also tell you that you can make, that you can do quite much in order to reduce the number of crimes reported. Still, are there, based on your research finding, if we stick to the situational crime prevention policies, what kind of policy measures would you propose as practical solutions? Trying to be more specific and give me examples of what you think we would really do better in that sense.
Anybody? Ron?
Well, it depends on what the problem is. You have to be extremely specific in coming to solutions depending on the problem. There isn't any general solutions except very broad objectives like increasing the risk, reducing the reward, making it more difficult and so on. But if you want specifics, you have to say, what's the problem? Which particular problem are you talking about? Because you need to implement quite different measures. For example, if you're trying to reduce car theft, than if you're trying to reduce cyberbullying. Those are completely different crimes. And they are driven by completely different opportunities, completely different skills are needed to do them. So that's what one has to ask first. What is the problem? And it needs to be highly specific if you're going to come up with practical solutions. That means it's a very long-term process because this problems change with changes in society. And we have to be very much on our toes all the time, watching for new crime opportunities, and they come at us from every angle. At the moment, we're getting them from the internet. That'll go on for years or forever. And that's a completely new set of crimes that we have to worry about. We don't tend to think about those when we think about crime. We tend to think about street crime. But of course, street crime is only one small portion of all of the crime that we need to worry about. I don't want to give you more work, but that's what I think is going to happen.
You've got something to add to that?
Yes, I was nodding because I agree that it absolutely depends on the particular situation. I mean, that is the key to all this stuff. And I mean, for instance, you wouldn't just give a general pill to try and solve all health problems. So you need to be very specific to the situation and the context. You know from the work we've been doing that we've been looking at the systematic review evidence on what works in different circumstances, in different situations. And again, it's very telling in terms of the fact that we know, for instance, from the systematic evidence that CCTV has a fairly positive reductive effect on crime. However, that's a general effect. And what you need to know about is how that varies according to the particular situation. So, for instance, we know that CCTV works much better in the setting of a car park, for instance, for vehicle crime than it does for city centre violence. And so it's knowing those specific things which is useful for practitioners in making implementation decisions. So, yeah, I think another thing that's important is thinking about cost. And I think that perhaps cost isn't thought about enough from the point of view of the information that we're collecting out there. So, for instance, yes, CCTV might generally work, but how much does it cost compared to some of the other easier, cheaper measures, like just telling people they need to close their windows in a student area, those kind of things. So I think that there's effectiveness, but we also need to be thinking about cost effectiveness.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things we need to think about as far as cost is concerned is on whom does the cost of crime fall? So, for example, with internet crime, the cost of crime does not fall on the internet service providers, but they're the ones who are competent to change that situation, reduce those opportunities, and therefore reduce the crime, which actually speaks to the points Lorraine was making, I think, in terms of partnerships and leverage.
So, because that's, you're talking about camera surveillance.
Yes.
Because that's quite, there are different views about that also. You know, there's the service here in Sweden saying, well, the effect of that is not really that good. You know, I mean, afterwards you can solve the crime, but to be sure that it really has a prevention effect, that's still very discussed. But you say that this is one of the most effective ways that you can have one of
for car crime,
for car
in garages. Yeah.
If you then let's be more specific then.
Exactly.
If you can just, because I'm looking for the practical solutions. If you can just single out, I mean, you know the world's crime prevention strategies, single out a couple of strategies, practical solutions that you want to highlight and say, they are doing this in that country and that is very effective, and they are doing that in that country and that is very effective on that crime. I'd like to have some, so it's going to be a little bit more practical for us, so we understand.
You're looking for a general pill.
No, yes, I'm looking for effective measures.
Yeah.
You may know there were 25 situational approaches. I'm sure we can make it available to you, this thing. And so each of them target hardening, removing excuses, so and so and so and so. One of them is controlling tools and weapons. And coming over, I read in the newspaper a fascinating little snippet. And it's about suicide, which isn't crime, but it used to be, which was the Israeli Defense Army were having a real problem with young soldiers going away at the weekends with their guns, and the suicide rate was really quite high. So they just stopped them taking their guns home for the weekend, and the suicide rate halved. So, I mean, that's just one, as I say, it's suicide, but I mean, it's applicability, that's just one of the 25 measures. And it might be useful at some stage for you to look over those 25 measures, and I'm sure we can group the successful programs under them.
Lorraine, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. And I think there's a range of different ways for policymakers to get access to publicly available synthesis of what works in different situations. I mean, the What Works Centre in the UK has done a systematic review of the systematic review. The Campbell Collaboration has a library of systematic reviews in crime and justice. My team at the University of Queensland is building the Global Policing Database that's done an extensive review of all the evaluation evidence in policing from 1950. So the tools are now there to synthesise the literature and make it very accessible to policymakers. I think the issue there for policymakers is is a lot of the evidence gets lost in translation, and so how we can provide that information in a digestible way for policymakers so that where there's a problem that emerges, that there's very accessible access to the research evidence.
Mm-hmm. Ron, yes.
Yes, I'd just like to add that I think that the overall message that comes out of the work that many people in this room have been doing for a long time is that crime control is going to get a lot more complicated. It is because crime is very complicated. We've simplified it by talking about crime, but actually there's so many vast differences between every category of crime, and there are hundreds of different categories of crime, all of which rely on their own opportunity structure that we have to understand if we are going to tackle them. It'll be a case of which are the things that we should be tackling first. But in every case, it's going to be much more complicated than we thought before. We simplified the problem by calling it crime. Well, that is an oversimplification that has messed up a lot of our crime thinking, crime policy thinking. Crime is a collection of hundreds of diverse kinds of behaviors, all of which depend on their own opportunity structures. We have to try to analyze those opportunity structures. We can't do it all at once. We have to pick and choose. We have to pick the most troublesome crimes, the ones we really want to deal with, and understand how those crimes are committed, what they depend upon, what are the social and situational factors that come together at a specific point to allow those crimes to happen. And then we have to think about how we can change that. Now, that is very, very much more complicated than arresting people and dealing with them under the criminal justice system. But we have found to our cost that that doesn't really work very well. There's a lot of research showing that. I mean, we have to have a criminal justice system, of course. We need that for other reasons, for processing offenders. But we can't rely on the criminal justice system to reduce crime. Well, not much. We have to think very carefully about each specific kind of crime and think about what we could do as a society to deal with that specific crime. So it's going to be a very complicated world for criminal justice policymakers. It ought to be a lot more complicated for academics, and I think it gradually is becoming more complicated for academics. But in the long run, every single entity in society has crime risks attached to it. Some of those are serious, some are not quite so serious, but we have to understand that they are very specific and very complex and very wide-ranging. That's going to change the whole landscape, or should.
I think if we're talking to policymakers at government level, there are some big drivers like alcohol, so get your alcohol policy right, the internet, so make sure and interestingly with the internet, it's not about catching offenders because they could be in Nigeria. It's about designing the system so that it doesn't facilitate crime. It's about blocking opportunities that are facilitated by those big drivers. Motor vehicles is a great example because that's the success story. where they were redesigned and car theft dropped by 70%. So those big drivers at national level can be addressed. I think in Sweden, for example, your policy on alcohol is massively better than the British policy on alcohol. And we've got a lot to learn from you, but I think our politicians are a bit nervous about challenging the power of the drinks industry, to be honest. So there's a role for politicians centrally to actually, they're required to be brave and face some of these people who control the systems that facilitate the crime. That's my opinion, and I'm supposed to keep my mouth shut, but I'm not famous for that. What's the next question, Minister?
Very good. So is there, where should we start? In what area, if we're taking to situational crime prevention, where should we start? In which area and with what issues? And what type of crime?
Lorraine?
Okay, so we know that there's the law of concentration of crime. So we know, as you had pointed out, that there's a very small number of people who are generating a large number of the crime problems, but we also know that places, in fact, the law of concentration of crime says that that places are more concentrated than those people that are contributing to the crime problem. And we know that there's certain situations also that are some situations are causing more of the crime problems than others. So I think the first thing is being able to understand that law of concentration, so that you're using your scarce resources in the criminal justice system to know which of your places, people, situations are generating the problems. So that's a really good starting point. Another really, just one more quick point there, Gloria, sorry, is that too often interventions have been around for many years, so that you've introduced an intervention. It might not have been subjected to an empirical evaluation. You actually don't know whether or not it works, yet you continue to fund, not you, but many programs continue to be funded year in, year out. And with scarce resources, you just can't afford to do that. So retiring those programs or practices that don't work is as important as introducing and making sure that you're testing and introducing policies that do work.
Absolutely.
Actually, just a short added point on that one. It's also important, I think, to make sure you maintain measures where it's cheap to do that and you continue to have a crime reductive effect. So an example, for instance, is alligating, as we were talking about before, where you gate off the back of an alley and it reduces a crime problem such as burglary. That reduction continues, which is really good for us all. So as long as you maintain those gates and you enable the residents to effectively use those gates, then you've got continuous crime prevention for a prolonged period of time. And that's very cost effective.
Right. I wonder if I could just pick up on a point that I think the Minister was interested in the sense of early intervention, if you like. Would any of you like to comment on the idea of how we can get situational crime prevention into schools in terms of controlling the school environment so that the children learn at an early age that there are rules and that they have to be followed, and just thinking of schools as a context within which it's a learning environment for children. What can we introduce there by way of teaching them that crime doesn't pay, if you like? Any comments? What kind of crimes happen in schools, for example?
I'm not sure I'd buy that.
How about bullying?
Mostly because it's trying to change people again.
Well, it's trying to stop crime in the school.
Well, you can...
Bullying.
Yes, you could do it. You could do it, but whether it has any long-term effect, I have no idea, because I'm interested in a specific problem. So, I mean, I would rather try to find something that society was really annoyed about at the moment, and put my effort into trying to understand why that happens and can we do anything about it now? And we almost certainly can. Whenever you analyze a particular problem, you always find ways of intervening. I don't know what they are now. I don't even know what the crime is. But once you've identified, the crime, or the very specific crime, well, then you can think about how it happens, who's doing it, what are the conditions that occur that make it happen easily, and change that. So I'm very much unhappy or disappointed with the whole idea of trying to change people. I don't think it's very effective, and I don't think it's worked very well. And I speak as a psychologist, which I'm trained in. I think that we have to take a different approach, and I think that what we have on offer here is a whole toolkit of ways of dealing with crime. And the toolkit is very, very detailed. It still needs developing, but it does provide a good set of things to use on any specific crime problem. So you tell me what the problem is, and I'll help you solve it. But I can't tell you generally what to do. You're still in charge, but you have to define the problem.
Anybody
Well,
else?
if one of our problems now is that we have a lot of young boys being recruited into criminal gangs, how do you deal with that in the situational prevention?
How do we do what?
How do you deal with that with your
gangs.
strategies?
Young boys getting into gangs. Well, it depends what they're doing.
If you don't want to change people,
No.
say, you don't want to change people, then how do you deal with that
I'd like
problem?
to change people, but the history of doing that is very unproductive and unhappy. We haven't really succeeded. So if you're not, it's no good going on batting one's head against something that we can't do very well. We need to focus on the things we can do well. Now, if those young boys are, I don't know what they might be doing, I can't imagine, but you know, give me an example of what they're doing, and then I can tell
They're
you
riding motorbikes like lunatics all through Sweden, and it's really annoying the minister.
No, they're dealing drugs.
They deal drugs, they ride bikes, they upset everybody, they're in a
Well,
gang.
then, that's so many problems, I don't know quite what you do with each of them. You have to identify what the main problem is and what you want to do about it. It's no good saying...
I think what you're doing is assuming they're doing all this because they're unemployed, and that's a huge assumption.
Yeah, I'm asking you. This is the expertise.
Well, what I'm...
And you asked me, well, tell me what your problem is, and then
Yeah.
I would come up with a solution. And then I said, well, my problem is that.
But
now tell me the solution then.
The other thing about situational prevention, I mean, I often get asked this, what would you do about X? And I always say, I have no idea, because I don't know why it's happening or how it's happening. I need to make a study and understand quite clearly what the problem is, what are the conditions giving rise to it, how we can deal, which of those conditions can we change, which of them can we not, which of the ones that we can change do we think will reduce the problem, how much will it cost, is it socially acceptable, and a whole range of other questions. But it's complicated, is the point.
I know it's complicated.
That's
why I'm asking you
Lorraine,
to help us to solve it.
And not disputing what Ron's saying, we do know some things that don't work. So my team at the University of Queensland, Angela Higginson at the University of Queensland, has done a systematic review of what works to reduce gang problems. Now, there's not a huge amount of empirical evidence to support that, but what we do know is to not take them away and into group-based intervention programs. That just actually compounds the problem. So we do know some things that don't work, probably more than what we do know that does work. So don't take them away and...
I mean, David
send
Kennedy's
them off
work
to
on
a
gangs
nice
and
care.
guns, where they're shooting each other, or gangs that are drug dealing, is very powerful demonstration of the importance of increasing the risk to offenders. In fact, increasing the probability of capture to 1. As most offenders don't get caught. I mean, we all know that. But if you increase the probability of capture to 1 and tell them ahead of time, here's what's going to happen, that's one way of addressing that particular problem. Can anyone like to comment on timescales here? I've been reminded of it. Ron's answer was like, well, you'll have to be patient while I think about it, and I'll get round, work it through, and I'll come back in 2 years with the answer. I will answer you, but it'll take a while. Whereas ministers have an eye on the election, quite understandably. They want results, they want them now. Is there a conflict there, or can you be patient?
What about?
About waiting for the answer.
No.
You want the answer now.
But you were advocating early intervention and stuff at childhood, so you can be patient. You'll wait for 30 years to see whether that works.
Because, well, I do believe that you can change people. I mean, that's where we're different. I do believe that people who are being raised in an environment where they are appreciated and loved, and where they have opportunities, then the risk for them to getting into criminal gangs are lower than that would have been else otherwise. That's why. So with social policies, actually we can. I can put it in a way with change people, but we can make people behave in a way that they wouldn't have done otherwise. That's my point.
Coming back to who should be doing that is really is one of the important things. So, I mean, there are lots of people who are skilled at doing those things. I suppose one question is, should it be the police doing those things? I mean, to some extent, there's no point in sending the police out to try and educate school children in a way that they're not very good or able or well equipped to do that. But maybe they are better at knowing we've got a crime problem that looks like this in this particular situation. Here are a suite of different measures we can use to.
Still, we do that. I mean, we have police officers in school talking to children, making them understand what rules there are and what risks there are, and so far. Is that a bad idea?
No.
Well, there's would anyone like to comment on the evidence for that idea?
One very popular, internationally popular approach to teaching children it's not a good idea to start taking drugs is a so-called DARE, D-A-R-E program. And enormously popular because it sort of seems to be a good idea. So they send in police officers and they give little lectures every week and they do exercises. And it's been shown to have absolutely no effect on teenagers' drug taking.
It makes it worse.
So it's a bad idea, is it?
It's
not cost effective.
It's a bad
certainly
idea.
it's a bad
It's
idea.
a waste of money.
Yes. One of the older results from research is that parental supervision is an extremely important factor. That a high level of supervision by parents, a consistent level of supervision by parents, really does differentiate between those who get into trouble and those who don't.
But then if I say that sometimes the parents are part of the problem,
well, sure they
solution.
are. Sure they are. But
So,
I mean, it's as good a pointer as some of the other things you've mentioned that in fact, get across to parents that actually they make a difference. Marcus, I was reading the program and I saw that Marcus Felsen in his presentation, in relation to his presentation that he's going to give, made the point that actually parents now have more time and potentially therefore should be able to supervise better. That right, Marcus? Yes. Should be able to. But of course there are competing demands as well. I mean, there's a whole culture of not being overly protective towards your children, not being too supervisory, and so that's a problem. But for what it's worth, it is an old and rather forgotten finding from much early crime prevention research that what parents do makes a lot of difference.
Right.
And we've just finished a very large randomised field trial looking at truanting young people and getting those truanting young people back to school. So you probably won't need to come to the Jerry Lee lecture after I talk to you about this, but we have found that sometimes doing very simple things such as communicating to the parents their responsibilities, their legislative responsibilities to have the children attend school can actually mobilise the young person to go to school, which actually does seem to reduce some of the offending problems. So that's a mechanism. That's a mechanism to get those children back to school.
Would anyone like to comment on what the police can usefully do in the context of situational crime prevention? Because we've suggested going into schools isn't the most productive use of their time.
Well, the police can do problem-oriented policing, which is very like situational prevention. What police who are doing problem-oriented policing do, they try to identify what are the big problems they're facing repeatedly in the community, and then why are these problems occurring? How can they change the conditions that allow them to occur? And then whether they can try to implement measures that will change the settings and the conditions. It's very like situational prevention, actually. It's similar. It's not derived from the same well, it's got the same underlying human principles, but not the same disciplinary principles. It's come out of a police management approach rather than a criminological approach. So there is a type of policing that is very like what we're talking about, and that's at the local level usually. And I personally think I've been part of a group that promotes problem-oriented policing. It's very difficult to get the police to do it, unfortunately. It doesn't fit with their idea of what policing is about, which is catching offenders. It isn't actually preventing crime, although that's what they might say they're trying to do. What they're actually doing is trying to catch people and bring them to justice, which I'm not objecting to that. I'm just saying it's not preventing crime. If you're trying to prevent crime as a police officer, probably problem-oriented policing is the most generally useful thing to do, although there are other things that the police can do that have temporarily at least reduced crime, such as hotspot policing and other forms of policing of that kind. But it's problem-oriented policing that's most consistent with the approach we're talking about.
I'm conscious that we haven't persuaded the minister.
I have one more question about, because we just touched upon, we talked about police now, the discussion of civil society and organizations. How can they be more come into this work in a better way? And do you see that the civil society as one important part of a strategy?
I think.
Go no, please go.
I think what goes at the heart of that is police legitimacy. So where the police treat people with dignity and respect, where they give citizens voice in the encounter, we know that when those encounters are dealt with, police encounters with citizens are dealt with in a procedurally just way, it can increase citizen perceptions of police legitimacy. And when the police are seen as more legitimate, then they can police with consent, and that goes at the heart of police effectiveness, that they're going to be more effective when they can police, when citizens see them as being more legitimate.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, all I would say is it depends what we mean here. Are we talking about police not treating citizens well? If we are, there are probable solutions to that or ways we might improve it. For example, at the moment, highly popular is the idea of body-worn cameras. Now, that might improve interactions between the police and citizens. I personally believe it would, because there is a surveillance occurring at the spot that you want it, which is the interaction between the police and the citizen. I think that probably would be a good idea, but I'm sure there are very many complicating factors with body-worn cameras that I'm not aware of. They're so new, at least they're so new in the United States, that there's very little experience to draw upon. But I personally think that's not a bad idea for that particular problem of the police and citizens and unlawful use of weapons and unlawful use of force. I think that would be something I would look at if I were doing that type of job. Yeah.
I suppose there's also quite a lot of situational kind of based measures that can enhance people's positive feelings about the police. So, I mean, I suppose an example that comes to mind is thinking about dealing with repeat victimisation. So if you are a vulnerable household who's had your house burgled recently, to have a police officer come around and say, you know, you've got vulnerabilities here, we need to do something about this door and this window, and then you're going to be safer, and that's going to, it's actually giving a positive message to the community. And the great thing about repeat victimisation measures is that they don't just reduce crime to the victim, they also reduce crime generally in areas. So it actually shows, a lot of situational measures can show that the police care about crime problems.
Advice of how you're protecting your home. That's
and I mean, it's particularly useful if it's specific, and so that the police have gone in using analysis to say this is exactly the type of problem in this area. And we know from research that vulnerabilities are quite common across houses that are next to each other. So if you've got a vulnerability in this particular house, the back door is easy to knock in this way, then there's a vulnerability to the rest of there's often a vulnerability in the rest of the street. And you know as an officer that a good way of helping out is to find that vulnerability and target hard on it for the entire community at risk.
It does mean pointing out to a recently distressed victim that there is quite a big chance that they're going to be victimised again, which can cause a few problems. But on the other hand, the victim at that point is very receptive to advice.
And will fundamentally be safe if they take the advice.
Yes. Absolutely. So what I was going to ask you all to do was come back to the Minister's question really about the social situational balance and his quiet conviction that you can change people. I wonder if you could think a bit about the drop of, say, 70% in car crime, 50% in burglary, all the massive reductions in crime that we've seen in the Western world over the recent past. And I know maybe internet crime's gone up, but let's just set that aside for the moment. Property crime has definitely dropped. Have we changed people's behaviour? Have we changed people?
Or have we just moved the crime from one place to
you're
another?
asking about displacement. Kate, let me invite you to comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously a big challenge in looking at things that are very focused geographically, and a lot of situational measures are focused geographically, is ultimately answering that question, which is, does it just shift crime problems from where it was to another place nearby, somewhere similar in nature? And there are both theoretical and empirical sort of answers to that question. So I can briefly give you the empirical answer to that question in terms of situational prevention. So we've done work, I did work with Rob Durrett. Is he here somewhere? Yes. And we looked at, we reviewed all the situational crime prevention evidence in terms of the evaluations, and looking at that evidence as a whole, we saw that generally, overall, they were effective. So I think about 75% of them were shown a positive effect of the scheme. And so then you've got the question, oh, okay, 75% showing a positive effect, does it just move elsewhere? In a number of studies, in enough studies, we were able to, they've looked at spatial displacement and spatial displacement particularly is when it's shifted from one location, usually to a nearby area, often to a zone just surrounding the original place that the measures went in. And we found systematic evidence of displacement in, I think, about 25% of cases. However, we also found systematic evidence of something known as diffusion of benefit, which is the opposite of displacement, in about the same number of cases, about 25% of cases. And that is when not only do the offenders avoid the area where the treatment has gone in, but they actually also avoid the area where displacement might spread to. So that's positive. And we're going to be talking about a systematic review that we've done later on this afternoon, looking at situational crime prevention measures and displacement. And the overall message from the statistics shows that there is not a there's no significantly statistical effect of displacement whatsoever. So there's just no systematic evidence that it happens from all the studies that we've looked at.
There is another way of changing not just the place where things are happening, but also shifting from one crime to another. If some crime becomes more tough to commit, then, well, we stop with another crime.
So there you go. How do you deal with that one?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, reviews also do sometimes look at those types of things. And so there's some evidence that crime switch sometimes happens. And again, sometimes it doesn't happen. There's evidence that that tactics displace. So the same activity goes on, just using a different method. But there's also evidence that that doesn't happen. I mean, the thing is, we rely on the evidence that's collected at the primary evaluation level, and we need to have more studies that focus on other types of displacement. But from the evidence that we have, everything seems to suggest that it doesn't seem to be a very big problem.
I suggest that the angle you're coming at, which is something we hear an awful lot, is that, okay, we've cut burglary, we've cut car crime, but look at all that cybercrime, look at all that internet crime. Is that your angle?
No, in a way. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, if it becomes more difficult to steal a car, because we protect our cars in a better way, well, then you might go over to steal something else, which is easier.
Well, Kate said there isn't that much evidence for that.
No, that was my question.
Well, there's no compulsion to commit crime. You commit crime if it's easy, you're not going to get caught, that kind of thing. So if you make it harder to commit crime, there's no real reason for a person to try and find something else to do. There may be for that 5% you were talking about, but actually, for the vast majority of individuals, they will do something else. They don't have to commit crime. There's no compulsion to commit crime. People commit crime when it's easy, then they're not going to get caught, when it's rewarding, when all kinds of things are favorable for doing it. But it doesn't mean to say that if you stop them doing that, they're going to do something else. If you put speed bumps in along a commuter road, those drivers are not going to go and find some other route to go and speed on. They speed because it's easy and they're not going to get caught. And that's true. That's a simple analogy for a great deal of crime, that people do it because it's rewarding. They get a benefit from it. But if there's no particular benefit, well, they're not going to do it. Some small proportion might carry on speeding desperately when they can, but most people speed. I mean, we all speed. I speed, you speed, everybody speeds when the conditions are correct. But we don't speed recklessly through Stockholm in the middle of the afternoon because we're going to get caught, I hope.
What about, well, because some say that the sentences are extremely important here. I mean, how the punishment is in the long run. Is that something, because you said is if it's rewarding, if it's a risk being caught and so on. What about the argument for those who are saying, well it's also about how high the sentences are?
The simple answer from all the literature is that it is the certainty of getting caught, not the severity.
Yeah. That's the point I was looking for.
Lorraine?
Grandmother X?
Yeah.
I was just going to give a street-level drug dealing example to come in behind what Ron was saying, that if you create difficulties for people in terms of searching for street-level drugs, and you can increase the search time, you can dissuade people from particularly newcomers to the market to access drugs. So there's some very specific things that you can do that are going to help dissuade people from accessing drugs.
I wonder if I can put a suggestion to the four of you, which the Minister might be provoked into agreeing with. Supposing I hypothesise that the situational crime prevention measures that have been implemented over the last 20 years or so have been incredibly successful, and what they've done is stopped all the opportunistic crime, for argument's sake, all the easy stuff, all those opportunistic offenders who will go home and play with their laptops as an alternative. But we're now left with the 5%, hardcore. What's your response to how we deal with that, if that's where we are now at? Is this anything that you'd like to advise the Minister about?
Well, intense surveillance of them so that they know you're breathing down their neck. And obviously the identification of them, but you've suggested you sort of do know who they are at an individual level. And one has to say, if they are so prolific in their offending, that there would be an incapacitation effect by locking them up.
Well, the other thing is, you've got to remember that these people are operating in an environment where it's actually not that difficult to do things bad. And they thrive on that. If we made it harder for them to do the bad things, maybe they would do fewer bad things.
Fewer bad things.
We've assumed that there is a driving force of crime that these people exemplify. Well, they might, but they also are operating in the real world, and they have to make the same sort of decisions about whether to commit a particular crime or not as other people. If you make it harder for them, you may, I'm not saying you're going to eliminate them totally, but you might reduce the problem that they cause. I don't know.
Keep at it.
Yes, keep at it. Because it's not simply a matter of these bad people. It's that these bad people have opportunities to do a whole lot of bad things that we haven't really controlled properly.
And have any of you got any thoughts about the future, the new opportunities that might be emerging, that these 5% are going to?
I think the number is, if you're referring to I think the number is 2%.
2%?
2% made 50% of the
I think it might be
reported crime
7% in the UK, but we're all famously horrible compared to some places. I mean, I'm thinking, bankers, for example, are they part of your 2%? Or?
Huh?
Well, it's not just poor people or ill-educated people who commit crime. Sometimes it's seriously well-off people who have got fantastic educations, and even in our country, politicians have been known to.
Never in our country, never.
I appreciate that. I was being very context-specific on that one. But I think that the point I'm sort of making is everybody does it, and we have to be a bit careful about that. Has anybody got any final points they'd like to make in the last minute or so?
I think that what you said about thinking about what the next problem might be is an important one. And, horizon scanning, and we know that thinking about what new opportunities might arise as a result of, new types of technology and those kind of things is something we need to be doing. And if we can do it now and we can preempt a big crime problem, then it's the time to do it. So I think really focusing on, at the design stage, trying to think about inserting security measures is a really important...
Absolutely. At the design stage is the message. Okay, any other points finally, Lorraine?
I just want to say thank you for this. I think it's been quite an interesting discussion. It is important for us because we are now on the way of writing a new crime prevention program. The last one we had on a national level came in 1997, and there is one or two things that has happened during these 20 years.
Yes.
So we really have to update that, and we are going to deal with both the social prevention side, but also a lot about the situational prevention strategies, as we did already in the program in the late 90s. But now the crimes looks different than before, the opportunities looks different, the environment looks totally different, and of course we need to update that program. So we are just in the upstart of doing such a program. So this has been, I think it's very interesting discussion also in that perspective.
Can I thank our panellists, and can I especially thank the Minister, who I know is incredibly busy, for making such a lot of time to talk to us today. Thank you very much indeed.